Hello and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're super excited to welcome you to the second session in our Impactful Change Actions webinar series. Today's session will focus on global research trends and long-lasting effects of the COVID era. I'm Nellie Stansbury, Denison Consulting's Director of Digital Marketing. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to encourage you all to use the chat and Q&A features. Please test out their functionality by sharing where you're joining from. I'm joining from Ann Arbor. We've got Margaret in North Carolina, Brian from California, Austin in Iowa. Pretty dispersed group here from the US, but yeah, please share where you're joining. Our team will watch your comments and questions. We'll answer them throughout the session, and we'll also pose them to our speakers at the end of their discussion during Q&A. I'd like to now quickly introduce today's speakers before turning things over to them to get started. I'm joined by several members of the Denison team. Our speakers are Brian Adkins, partner at Denison, and Austin Adams, Director of Innovation and Research and Development. We're also joined by Margaret Gorman, VP of Sales and Marketing, who will be helping me answer questions throughout the session. With that, I'll turn things over to Brian and Austin to get started.
Great. Thanks, Nellie. Real quickly, I'll just go over the agenda for today's session. Before we jump into some of the trends that we've been seeing both in the early stages of the COVID era and things that we've seen continue, I'll do a little bit of context setting that I think might be helpful to help with that data interpretation. And then as we'll work through those insights, and then we'll try to allow at least a couple of minutes maybe for some questions at the end. And as Nellie said, please do send your questions in. We'll try to answer some as we go. We'll try to follow up with you if we don't have a chance to address them today. So talking about culture and context, and before we get into the data piece, there's a few things that we think might be helpful for you to understand. I know many of you join us are probably familiar with the Denison model that serves as the foundation for much of the work that we do. For anyone who might be new to us, you're seeing a representation of the model here on this slide. Our research through the years has really focused on those aspects of culture that we know drive performance. And this model represents 4 what we would call key cultural traits: the mission section, the red section, the consistency area there in yellow, the involvement section in green, and the adaptability piece in blue. And as you look at this model, one of the things you'll notice is that within each one of these traits, there are 3 indices that are submeasures, if you will, that we look at within each one of those traits. And when we transition from using the model to a survey, we've developed a set of survey items that go along with each one of those indexes that you see around the model. And so, for example, up in the top right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see where it talks about creating change. Creating change is an index within the adaptability trait. You'll see that there are 4 items that are associated with those, and then we provide scores for those. The reason why we thought it was important to just break this down pretty quickly is because as we started looking at trends that we've been seeing in culture over the last few years, one of the things that we quickly noticed was that you see some interesting trends at the highest level, at the trait level, so to speak. It gets a little bit more interesting as you get into the indexes within each one of those traits, and even more interesting when you actually drill down into the specific items, the things that we're asking about as part of the survey. And so you'll see that come to light in just a few minutes here. Another piece of, I'll call it context setting, that we thought might be important as we start to look at the data. One, I did want to give a shout out to the late Edgar Schein, someone who passed away less than a month ago, but whose work has really had a profound influence on our work at Denison through the years. We've used quotes of his many times. And I thought it was important here as part of the context as well, because he talks about culture as being, this set of, basic assumptions that groups have either invented, discovered, or developed as they've learned to cope with the problems of external adaptation and internal integration. That tension there, you can see it on the right side, represented pretty well in our model. But he talks about these things being taught to new people in the organization as this is kind of the way we do things around here. And what we've seen over the years is that culture tends to be a pretty stable measure in organizations. We don't see a lot of big swings when we're generally looking at culture in organizations. What we do see is what we would call more of an incremental improvement. So as we've collected data over time and looked at how organizations in general, again, progress over time, much more incremental improvement rather than these large swings in any direction on the areas that we measure. And I'll show you a visual of what we mean by that in just a moment. I do think it's important, though, as I say that while incremental improvement does seem to be the norm, the other thing that we've certainly noticed at Denison is that lots of organizations we work with who have taken a very intentional and deliberate approach to culture development and management far exceed the pace at which we see the average organization progress as they're trying to develop their culture. So just to give you a visual of what that looks like, here's going back to 2008 and showing profiles of organizations that we've collected in each of these years. And what we did is we benchmarked them against our current database. So in other words, organizations we collected data from in 2008, if we benchmark them against our current database, what does that look like, 2010, et cetera. And you'll see, particularly as you get into 2010, that on average, these organizations were in the low to mid 40th percentile, meaning by today's standards, they'd be operating just below average. If we fast forward all the way to 2021, 2022 here, you're seeing scores more in the low 50s, mid 50s, upper 50s. So a couple of percentile increases kind of year over year. So it says something about sort of the steadiness of culture, I think. And we think that that's just an important concept to have in mind as we jump in and start to look at some of the data. And for that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Austin, who's going to share some of the early trends as well as what we're seeing today.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So today we want to talk just briefly about some early trends that we were seeing kind of at the peak of the pandemic and kind of move into what are we seeing now, what areas of culture have returned to normal, what trends continue to persist over time. So ready to kick that away. Thank you. So you can see here, as Brian was mentioning, this is at a trait level, so kind of that highest level of the model. You can see kind of that steady incremental change over time. You can also see kind of right at the pandemic, this kind of upward shift in all traits of culture, because we're kind of at this highest, most aggregate level, seeing these shifts at this level, even with all of the kind of variance you see as you dive into the model is pretty significant. You can also see, though, that a lot of the gains that were seen during the pandemic and at the height in 2020 have since returned to kind of pre-pandemic levels. The kind of most significant spikes that we saw then were in capability development, empowerment of employees, the ability for the organization to create change, coordinate and integrate, as well as the vision of the organization. So early in the pandemic, leaders were focused on kind of crisis agility. I think many organizations are still focused on becoming more agile over time, focusing a lot on delegation of authority, internal coordination, collaboration. Really the ability of an organization to kind of pivot in the moment became critical during the pandemic. We see similar things in our data, specifically looking at organizations whose data we were collecting during the kind of height of the pandemic. And you can see the significance of things like creating change and empowerment, coordination and integration. You can see at an item level, even things like we are able to meet short-term demands without compromising our long-term vision. And so you can see again a really strong emphasis on the ability for organizations to pivot in the moment, to kind of react to changes in the external environment. And at the same time, Denison worked with many organizations to do that, whether that was managing coordination and collaboration challenges, implementing hybrid work models, developing team capabilities to kind of rise to current challenges. Many organizations were kind of fixated on that and their ability to kind of make it through the pandemic by being more flexible, being more agile. So the question is kind of, what are we seeing now? What of that persists? What has kind of been washed away and returned to pre-pandemic figures? So kind of moving into that first one is kind of gains that were temporary or unsustained. So you can see as an example here, you can access this deck after the webinar. The appendix will have most of the charts, but we want to kind of keep this insight focused for everybody. But you can see kind of these top trending lines and at a pre-pandemic marker where any gains have kind of already returned to normal. We've already seen a return back to kind of the trend that we've been seeing over time. Most areas of culture saw that kind of pandemic bump and then a dip back into kind of pre-pandemic era numbers. Growth and capability development, coordination and integration, as well as vision scores that drove the pandemic bump have since returned to those pre-pandemic levels. The kind of most significant jumps that we saw that have since returned to normal were continuous investment in skills of employees, the ability to meet short-term demand without compromising long-term vision, as well as decisions that are usually made at the level where information is available. So kind of that delegation point of empowering employees and allowing them to take action when they have the knowledge to do so. So in thinking about what gains have persisted over time, the kind of key pieces of culture that have persisted beyond the pandemic are still very much rooted in change and flexibility, agility, and organizations' ability to kind of pay attention to the external environment, not just necessarily the market, but society as a whole. Kind of the pandemic has kind of caused organizations, I think, to be a little bit more aware of their surroundings. And so creating change and empowerment scores still persist even now, some of which, for example, everyone believes that he or she can have a positive impact, has seen some recent decline, but sustains still a score that's higher than any pre-pandemic year. So there are some gains from the pandemic that not only have been sustained, but continue to be higher than we've ever seen them before, looking over the last decade to 15 years. The way that things are done is flexible and easy to change, shows a sort of possible rebound after falling back down to pre-pandemic levels in 2021. And so we're seeing, we saw kind of that pandemic bump and the same sort of dip, and now we're actually seeing a resurgence again in 2022 for this specific item. We respond well to competitors and other changes in the business environment continues to be sustained above pre-pandemic levels, and new and improved ways to do work are continually adopted, has also seen a little bit of decline, but still sustains a score higher than any pre-pandemic year. So there's a lot of focus here on creating change, some focus on empowerment that we've seen sustained over time and continue to be at levels that we had not seen prior to the pandemic. And the last piece, something that we've seen, and this really has only been seen around team orientation, is a potential harmful consequence on teamwork. And so we've seen a lot about capability development, giving skills to your employees to be able to tackle the crisis that's in front of them. We've also seen a lot of delegation of allowing employees to be able to make more decisions than they were before. And at the same time, we see kind of a plateauing or a flatlining at the pandemic of team orientation. The one kind of traditional pandemic bump and return to normal that we see is the question 10, which is work is organized so that each person can see the relationship between his or her job and the goals of the organization. So that has that kind of more traditional bump and return. However, cooperation across different parts of the organization is actively encouraged. People work like they're part of a team. Teamwork is used to get work done rather than hierarchy. All of those things kind of saw a flatlining and are now even continuing to dip. And so a question remains of what team orientation continues to look like in the future. And as organizations kind of pivot towards being able to be more agile, more flexible, is there a trade-off in kind of team orientation, doing the work together, making sure that everyone is kind of part of that team versus making sure everyone's executing a task? And so some questions around what team orientation looks like in the future, something that we're continuing to watch and kind of hoping to see a resurgence of in the future.
Yeah, that's great. First I want to thank Austin because he's really been diving into this data for some period of time now to identify some of these trends. And quite frankly, as we were going into this analysis, I don't think we really knew exactly what we were going to find. And some of this was not very surprising. Some of it was a little bit more surprising as we scratched away at it. This idea of some of the culture areas returning to their pre-pandemic scores, things like capability development, coordination, vision that are highlighted there. We do know from our work with clients that things like capability development were a little bit more challenging early on, both in terms of finding the time to do capability development, as well as just the way capability development was perhaps done in organizations. Anything from training to on-the-job training, those types of things were challenged. And so, while there was a lot of discussion, a lot of emphasis on how do we do these things, what we're seeing is that they've kind of leveled off back to what we saw pre-pandemic. And this area of gains, creating change, empowerment, as areas that seem to be still, sort of riding a bit higher than they were pre-pandemic. Probably not terribly surprising to us. We did see and work with a lot of organizations who had put so much emphasis in change. And I think, generally speaking, if nothing else, a lot of organizations came out of the early stages of the pandemic, realizing that, when pressed and when we really do have our backs against the wall, so to speak, we can adapt, we can change, we can really affect the way that we do things. And that often required giving people a little bit more flexibility and freedom in terms of how they did their work, and perhaps influencing some of those empowerment scores. And also, to some extent, not terribly surprising that the team orientation piece has actually dipped below some of the pre-pandemic levels. We heard that probably as much as anything from clients over the last few years, which is how, for clients who were more accustomed to having face-to-face interaction, people being co-located, how do we create that same sense of collaboration, camaraderie that we've been able to do in the past? And through different hybrid work models and trying to figure out that balance of in-person, out-of-office work styles and approaches, I think it's still a struggle for a lot of organizations to try to figure that one out. And so it really does raise some implications, and we recognize that we're still at some level in the COVID era. We're still seeing organizations struggle with trying to find that balance when we talk about hybrid workplaces. So still curious to see how some things will settle out. But this, this notion, I think a lot of us heard over the last few years about, we're going to bounce forward coming out of this. Well, I think it depends on how we think about bouncing forward. The data would suggest that in some areas, perhaps capability development, coordination, vision, team orientation, that we didn't really bounce forward. We bounced, but the data at this point doesn't necessarily suggest bouncing forward versus creating change and empowerment, which it would suggest has seen more of that bounce forward. But I want to put a caveat on that, because I think it's really important to distinguish between what and how. So even though things like capability development, coordination and integration, from a survey perspective, how people respond to a survey when they're asked about the effectiveness of these things, even though that may have returned to some of the pre-pandemic levels that we saw, it doesn't mean that the way we're developing people, or the way we're coordinating with one another, or the way that we're engaging with our customers, for example, hasn't changed. It most likely has in many respects. So I think it's really important when we talk about areas that have either regressed or have kind of come back to pre-pandemic levels, that we're not necessarily saying we've gone back to some sort of normal here, but rather we perhaps changed the way we did things. But the effectiveness of those changes, the perceived effectiveness of those changes in terms of our ability to develop people, to coordinate with others, to understand and be motivated by our vision, has returned to a level that we saw a few years ago. And I think, again, that says something about this persistence of culture. So I hope that helps to put some of these initial findings in some perspective. And at this point, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Nellie, because we should have time for perhaps just a couple of questions that maybe have come in that we can speak to, and see what people are asking about.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. We've got a lot of great questions. So if we don't get a chance to answer your question, our team will connect with you after the session. All right, a few good questions. There are two questions sort of relating to variations across region and industry. One being, are these trends consistent across Europe as well? And then a follow-up separate question, are there variations across industries? So if you could speak to sort of the diversity of the benchmark, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. In the geographic, so for example, by region or within industry, for the subgroups where we have enough data to do a similar analysis, because we do have some smaller industries represented in the benchmark as well. But for where we have data, we do see the same trends. And so, for example, the pandemic bump more broadly is kind of seen everywhere you look, regardless of how much data we have, or whether we're looking in industry or region, or whether it's a nonprofit versus a privately held organization. The pandemic bump, the kind of focus on change orientation, agility within the organization, all of those things are kind of consistent throughout, regardless of where we look. I think the one kind of variation or difference that we saw is kind of by location. I think there's to a large extent, when you look at countries who were able to better manage the pandemic, organizations in those countries certainly benefited from that. So you do see some variation there, but overall the trends here and especially kind of the key areas of focus and culture are persistent.
Thanks, Austin. Another question, have we seen any changes in the employee participation rate pre-pandemic to post-pandemic?
I would assume we mean participation rates that we see in our own surveys. And to that extent, no, we have not seen any change in participation rates. I think in general, most certainly participation varies by how it's messaged internally with the organization, all of these different things, but we haven't really seen a significant difference there. I actually anticipated that we might see participation rates go up just because the pandemic seemed to have caused people to kind of shift their focus internally into the organization more, but we haven't really seen a significant shift.
Yeah. And I think that it was interesting, especially if we sort of go back, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, organizations that were coming forward. And there were a lot of organizations who, I'll say 6 months, post the initial stages of the pandemic, were quite curious. How is this impacting our organization? How is this impacting our culture? They were a bit hesitant and unsure about sending a survey out. I think for a couple of reasons. One is, they were just unsure how people are going to respond, given all of the turmoil and disruption they had had in their businesses. But there was a lot of concern among organizations as to whether people would participate, because they just had so many things that they were working on and trying to sort through. And to Austin's point, I think most of our clients were pleased that people were taking the time to share where they were at, even though it wasn't necessarily higher than what we had seen in the past. They were getting at least the same level of participation.
Thanks, Brian. Looks like we have two questions that are, again, sort of related, not phrased identically, but I'll choose this one. Would you say that the up and down from 2019 through 2022 is more a response to internal, and they listed management decisions, internal relationships between, or relations between colleagues, teams, actions, or more influenced by external factors? So home office, new ways of communicating, hybrid work, etc. I think I know that it's a little bit of both, but I'll turn it over to both of you if you want to elaborate.
Well,
oh, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, I mean, in some respects, that's like the perfect external adaptation, internal integration that we talked about, sort of borrowing from that quote by Edgar Schein. From my perspective, for most organizations, it was definitely triggered by the external environment and what was going on in the external environment, which then meant, how do we internally respond to those changes? And we saw a lot of I think pretty interesting things over the last few years. Many of the organizations that we work with, who were very effective at teaming, very effective at coordination and integration, very effective at aligning people around a compelling vision, et cetera, for the future, continued to excel in these areas. If you think about our model, there's a little circle in the middle of our model that says beliefs and assumptions. And I think one of the things I took from that is that for those organizations who have that fundamental belief and assumption that teaming is important, that coordinating is important, taking care of your customers, aligning people around a compelling mission and vision for the future, they found ways to keep that going. They had to change, they had to adapt, but they found ways to keep those things going. I think the organizations who had been less intentional about their culture, who maybe didn't put the kind of energy into things like teaming, coordination, et cetera, found themselves in a much greater stressed position. But generally speaking, all of the organizations, regardless of their, I'll say, underlying beliefs and assumptions, had to find ways internally to adapt to that external change.
Great. I think we'll do one more question and then we'll try and wrap up. There are two questions. You guys are really pairing up. That's great. But one is any predictions possible for the future? And I think a similar one is, what do you suggest to capture some of the gains that we've seen and learn from those? If the two of you could share there as we're closing out here.
Go ahead, Austin. I'll let you take the first shot at that.
Yeah, I guess to start from, what do we see as kind of a potential of happening in the future? I think there are still a lot of questions about the pandemic, but also about our ability as a country in the United States, as a broader global community, to be able to respond to the next possible pandemic or potential kind of global economic crisis. And I don't think that many organizations are convinced that we're kind of done with this need for agility, for kind of being able to pivot in the moment. And so I think there's kind of an investment in that, and being able to kind of move forward, not just through long-term vision, but a sense that organizations who will be here 10 years from now, not just that they can see what 10 years from now looks like, but that they can see what next year and the year after looks like as well. So I think there's been a clear shift towards kind of short-term thinking and survival, and I don't see that going away anytime soon. In terms of being able to kind of capitalize on gains, I think part of that is first taking a moment to assess where those gains came from for your organization. We worked with a lot of organizations who were focused on kind of future of work. What does it mean to integrate into a hybrid model, not just logistically, but for their culture, for how people communicate with each other. And organizations who we've worked with over the last few years, who I see that are still successful today, are the ones who leaned into their culture, leaned into systems of communication and effective collaboration that are meant to or adapted to the hybrid model they have. And so for me, I think it's a difference of, were you being reactionary and rallying around your culture in the moment, or are you taking a moment to see the changes that were effective and kind of understand how you can continue to sustain those new norms, new structures in your organization, rather than, I think it's easy to return to how we did it 5 years in a row prior to the pandemic. And so being able to kind of capitalize on those gains really is about stopping, learning from what changes you've seen in your organization that have been effective, and kind of deciding what you want to carry forward with you.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think you've summed it up, pretty well, Austin. There's just one or two things that, in addition to that sort of stand out for me. One is, I do think organizations developed some new muscle, if you will, around that creating change empowerment piece, that hopefully that will be sustained going forward. I think the other thing that just struck me as I was listening to and working through all of this information is just, again, organizations are very complex. How things get done in organizations is challenging. And so even though we've adopted new ways of doing things in many cases, it comes back to the effectiveness of how well we do these things. And I think what we're seeing employees saying is that, yeah, we maybe are coordinating in a different way than we did in the past. We're maybe engaging with our customers in different ways than we did in the past. But the extent to which I feel like we fully understand our customers and are completely meeting their needs and responding to their needs still leaves some work to do, or the extent to which I think we're effectively coordinating with other parts of the organization still has some work to do. And so that it just says something about kind of that persistence of culture, and it says something about the persistence of just the complexity of getting work done in organizations. So those are some of the things that stand out for me. And one last thing I always think about is, prior to the pandemic, I would often have clients say to me, we're really good in a crisis. When we're confronted with the crisis, our people come together, they pull together, they get things done in ways that are just truly remarkable, and ways that are not sort of typical in how we do work day in, day out. And I think that's kind of a double-edged sword, is how do we, because we heard this throughout the pandemic, our people really came together to figure out how we were going to do the work that we do. But that also came with challenges in work-life balance and stress and burnout and lots of other things that came along with that. And so that ability to kind of discern between what can we learn from that? What are some of the practices, habits, behaviors that we can bring forward because they really showed that we can get some amazing things done? But how do we do that in a way that doesn't necessarily burn out the workforce at the same time? Will be some lessons that I think we'll continue to try to sort through.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Austin. All right. If we haven't gotten a chance to answer your question, as I said, we'll follow up. Our team will follow up to try and answer those for you. And we'll be sharing the recording and the slides with everyone who's joined. But thank you to everyone who's taken the time out of your day to be with us today. And thank you to Austin and Brian for joining and sharing these insights. It's been a lovely session. Look forward to chatting with you soon. And thank you again.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.